Welcome to Know Your Rights, New Jersey. I'm your host, Ronald Ponder. Today we're going to talk about the impact of American policy upon immigration rights. We're specifically going to discuss the Trump administration's order to Buy American, Hire American, and how it impacts the rights of workers and our economy. And today with us we have our friends David Nachman and Snehal Batra.
Thanks so much for inviting us.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to have you. Snehal, if you don't mind, let's start with you. Explain to our audience a little bit about this executive order, Buy American, Hire American.
Right. So this is an executive order that was signed a year ago by President Trump, Buy American, Hire American. And really, the aim of it is to protect U.S. workers. Okay, so what he wants to do is make sure that U.S. workers are paid fairly, increase their wages, and it's also to protect their economic interests by decreasing reliance on foreign national workers and foreign products.
So how does this executive order, is it a policy or does it tell us exactly how he's going to protect American workers?
So there is no policy per se, because it's an executive order. But what we've seen in reality is that things are changing. We have guidance from USCIS, Department of Labor, Department of State.
Well, and for
my
audience,
right?
Okay, yeah. So it's for my audience. USCIS is. Can you give us a little bit specific?
Sure, it's the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service.
Okay.
So what he's doing is he's calling on these agencies to really strictly police the visa programs. So that's part of the Hire American component of the executive order.
So the visa programs, for the audience, are the programs that allow foreign workers into this country?
That's right.
And I think in terms of a global view of this, and it's more, not so much legalistic, it's kind of, doesn't it reek of isolationism in a way? I mean, it sounds like he's just saying we want to be isolationist, and think about how that reflects on the world. I mean, how does the world look at these words?
Right.
I mean, the world, I think that the world does not see the United States the way it did under the Obama administration now, because I think President Obama was much more open to dealing with the world and much more willing to do handshakes and be conciliatory. Here we have something completely different. This is like 180 degrees now. So what is the perception of other countries about the United States? And so that, I think, is sort of rearing its ugly head in the immigration policy. And that's, I think, one of the areas that we're going to really sort of focus in on.
Plus, I also want to mention the Buy American component. So he's also requiring the federal government to basically procure goods that are manufactured in the U.S. when possible. So he's urging the federal agencies to use American-made products as well. So that's the Buy America component of the executive order.
So in the work that both of you do, have you found any specific programmatic impact of this order or this philosophy?
Absolutely. I mean, first off, there's 10,000 new ICE officials that have been hired. So that's really, they're cracking down on these site investigations for a lot of these visa programs. There's
explain that. So
Sure.
it's site investigations for what programs?
Well, there are a variety of Worksite investigations. It's great that you raised that, because that didn't really even go into my thinking about what to raise for this. So that's really good. So what Snehal's saying is that there are many different types, many forms of worksite investigation that go on. Mm-hmm. One of them, which we know very well, is the Department of Labor investigation, where the U.S. Department of Labor is going out and ensuring that individuals who are in particular positions that are sponsored positions by U.S. employers are actually being paid the federally mandated prevailing wage, the greater of the federally mandated prevailing wage or the actual wage, depending upon which one is higher. So that's
Is there a problem with that?
Well, if you're not paying the federally mandated prevailing wage, it's bad because then you're displacing U.S. workers, and that's what, as you know, sort of lies at the heart of when you do an H-1B.
That's the H-1B, right,
So,
criteria.
yeah, and so a lot of people, and this is something that the media sort of gets wrong a lot. So you heard it here first.
All right,
You're the one who's bringing it out there. A lot of people think that H-1Bs are displacing U.S. workers, but what the media tends to forget is that in order to do an H-1B, you have to do what's called an LCA. And I'm sorry, I'm with the acronyms again.
But an
LCA is a labor condition application.
Okay.
Which means that you have to do a filing with the U.S. federal government. It's actually the U.S. Department of Labor, and it has to be posted in two conspicuous
attestations
places.
or promises that you're making.
That the employer is not going to displace U.S. workers. The employer is not going to treat foreign workers differently than they treat U.S. workers, and they're going to pay the greater of the federally mandated prevailing wage or the actual wage.
Plus that they would also offer the foreign national the same benefits that they offer to U.S. workers. That's the fourth component of the
So there's
LCA.
right, exactly. So essentially what they're doing is they're making sure that foreign nationals are not being discriminated against in the workplace, and they're making sure that U.S. workers are not being treated differently or being displaced by foreign workers. So that's a thing that like the media just doesn't get right a lot of times, and it's really good to sort of get that out there.
So in addition to the increase of ICE activity, what other changes have you noticed?
Well, there's also you also see worksite enforcement by ICE to do I-9. So there's one type of investigation called an I-9 investigation, where what they do is they go out and they make sure that the I-9s have been done properly. The I-9 form, most people know what an I-9 form is because everyone's done one. If you've ever been an employee, an I-9 form is a document that shows that you have the documentation to demonstrate that you're work authorized.
Right.
And every employer is required to do an I-9 form for every single employee.
Okay.
Okay, so that's enforced by ICE. They go out and they do these audits.
Now, are these audits random? Have they increased the ability of ICE to do masses of these audits?
Well, they say they're random, but as we know, they.
I see that. So this is. So they're not.
It's triggered. It could be triggered by a number of different reasons. So the I-9 audits, could be triggered as a result of, maybe the Department of Labor investigation on wage and hour. But typically, what we see is the FDNS, the Fraud Detection National Security Unit, that perhaps stems from the Department of State when the individual is applying for an H-1B visa abroad. So they'll start investigating the company, the beneficiary. If something doesn't sound right, then what they do is they send out an investigator to do a site visit to make sure that the company is legitimate, that the employee will be placed where the LCA indicates where he's going to be placed. So it could be triggered from many different, sources. But, the end result is there is this investigation. Now they're going to look at all of the foreign nationals that are on the payroll. They could ask for the I-9s for all the employees. So, it's basically a, ripple effect.
Have you seen this happen?
All the time.
We have
many active investigations.
Several investigations that are going where we come in to help the employer understand. Oftentimes what will happen is the officer from the government will come in and ask for information or documentation.
Visits. That's the other thing.
Exactly.
They're unannounced.
So these days, what are you finding to be, and this is a little off track, finding to be the demeanor of these officers in executing? You've been doing this work for a long time, so has there been a change in the demeanor and the approach of?
I think it depends on the investigation. So investigations emanate from many different places. I was working on what's called an H-1B site visit yesterday. The officer was very amenable. He sent over the documents that he wanted to have. He sent over his questions and he said, look, get me what you can by the end of the day tomorrow, and then anything else I want by, and then he gave me a date, about a week from now when I have to get it to him. So some of them are willing to work with you. I think in the I-9 context, they're not as willing to work with you as they used to be, because there's some people who have committed fraud where what they've done is at the midnight hour, they've developed I-9 forms. They've developed I-9 forms at the midnight hour, and that's a bad thing because especially because the auditors who are doing these investigations for the government can actually tell when the ink's still wet.
I think we were recently at a Department of Labor speaking engagement, and one of the investigators had mentioned to us they actually saw that there was a stapler on the I-9 form that they copied, and they said, where is the second page of this? Because they saw that they copied the document which had the staple on it. So,
and that gives you the idea of the detail that these auditors are, looking at these documents with. So it's really interesting.
Any other changes? So, for example, what about the processing of H-1B visas?
So many changes there. So I think one of the main major changes that has happened is not really in context of the H-1B, but just overall all of the applications. So there was a recent policy memo issued by CIS talking about how each extension application is going to be looked at as a new application. So typically the policy in the past has been if you have a visa, H-1B, L-1A, and you file an extension, then it's basically reviewing, making sure everything is legitimate, there's no fraud, and then you get your approval. Now the policy will be is they're not going to give deference to the initial approval. They're going to look at everything again for the first time. So we're all concerned about this because we were filing extension applications. You don't submit the whole package typically when you do the extension, but now it's going to have to be like a new filing. So that's concerning.
It's also, I think, distressing for us because that translates into additional time and additional documentation and information that we have to give to the government, which we didn't have to before. And that translates, unfortunately, into higher fees for the clients because we're required to spend much more time on these filings. So, it's become, doing the immigration piece of a transfer now has really become a very complex and sophisticated endeavor where whereas a lot of companies have done this stuff in-house in the past, have found that they really can't manage it in-house. And so, we have found that our skill sets are being called upon to help them to, get through the, to get through the labyrinth. So
We'll take that very concerning, as it is, comment and take a break. And we'll be back with Snehal and David after this break. Welcome back to Know Your Rights New Jersey. We're here with Snehal and David talking about Buy American, Hire American executive order and its impact on the immigration rights and on our economy. Snehal, let's talk a little bit about any new laws that have come out of this philosophy, this executive order. Are there?
So what's interesting is that there are no new laws per se. So, you have to go through the regulatory process to pass new laws. That hasn't happened yet as a result of this executive order.
And this has been over a year?
This has been a year now, right. But we have seen policy guidance that have been issued by the U.S. Immigration Service. I think at least a half a dozen of them, specifically as a result of this Buy American, Hire American policy.
For example, and what's the impact of these policy?
So, one of the ones we just talked about was that they're not giving deference to the previous approvals, so we have to submit everything all over again.
Right.
Another one pertaining to the H-1B visa category is the third-party placement. So when you
What's
have
that? What's third-party placement?
Third-party placement is when you have an H-1B petitioner that wants to hire a foreign national, but they're going to place this worker at a third-party work site to work on behalf of a project for a client.
Okay, not work directly for the petitioner, which is the company.
Well, that's interesting because they do need to establish, which is what this policy memorandum is saying, is that they want to make sure that there is an established relationship between the U.S. petitioner that's sponsoring the application and the worker. So now what they're requiring is that if you have a worker that you're placing at a third-party work site, they want to see contracts, they want to see itineraries, that there is this ongoing employer-employer relationship between the petitioner and the employee.
And they're going a step further to say that if you can demonstrate that you have enough work to keep the person busy,
Right.
they actually have the discretion to cut back the amount of time that you ask for on the H-1B. So for example, if you ask for 3 years, but you can't demonstrate enough H-1B work, then what they're going to do is they can cut it back to whatever they feel the work is in terms of the
And in
time.
fact-
So I'm not an expert at this, but there sounds like an awful lot of discretion in that policy,
Right.
and not enough definition, not enough definiteness.
So
in-
these are some
Right.
of the ways that, you know, they are using this executive order and guidance to make these decisions. You know, if they feel that, okay, we want to slow the process down or make it tougher, that's what they're going to do.
Do you remember those lively decisions in civil procedure in law school where you would go back and forth and discuss what is discretion?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
so,
absolutely.
and that's the thing. It's very difficult for us as lawyers to try to explain to our clients, well, it's discretionary. And they, you know, when you say that to a client, they're like, okay, and they just, you know, move on. But for us, we know that's so frustrating because we can't pinpoint necessarily a way to answer their questions because it's ultimately up to how an officer is going to decide. So we do the best we can within the realm of what we know to be able to help our clients predict the result. But of course, at the end of the day, it becomes terribly discretionary. In this environment, as you can imagine, we were just talking about this before the show, it's a tremendous roller coaster ride because
Yes.
every day there's something new.
Right.
We bring, you know, I was saying to you, I bring home 6 inches of paper every night. I'm trying to read through it because my clients in the morning are picking up the phone. They're saying, well, what's the result of this? What does this mean for my case? And it's very difficult for us to try to predict when things are swinging so much. And I think you had mentioned that this is like the president's way is swinging back and forth, but he's driving us completely nuts.
One thing I just want to add again with this ability for the adjudicating officer to limit the 3 years is that what's going to happen? Let's say you ask for 3, they give you 1 year. Now, a year into that, the employer is going to have to file another extension. Okay, so more legal fees, more filing fees.
For the employers.
These
Yeah.
are, you know, these are not inexpensive applications. Their government fees are pretty,
And
pretty
this
extensive.
must be very disruptive for the lives of the workers.
Absolutely.
Tremendously. Disruptive in terms of their personal lives. I mean, think about it, is that we're getting calls from people who are like, okay, you know, I'm coming to the end of my H-1B and I want to travel, and what is the possibility of my being able to go home and see my family? You know, and these are very common, you know, very common questions that we get, and there's not a lot of predictability that we can give them. I mean, I think that we're really telling our clients, if you really want to be 150% safe, don't travel. Don't leave the country. And that's a really hard pill for people to swallow when they have, you're talking about, we are a very international country. I don't know if you know, and people want to go and see their families. People have interests outside the United States they need to tend to. And it's very difficult when you have to tell them, no, you can't go.
So in another show we had, specifically on H-1B visas, we talked a bit about treaties and agreements and international agreements. So how does this Buy American, Hire American policy impact that?
Well, part of it, the Buy American is that the executive order instructs and requires now the federal government to really focus on acquiring goods, materials, and products that are made in America. So as David mentioned, you know, we are stepping back from this global view of the U.S. You know, we're becoming more insular.
Yeah.
That, you know, we're going to try to use American resources, the workforce, to really build up and strengthen our economy. At least that is what President Trump is saying.
And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, remember, it's all about balance, right? It's, you know, so we have to be mindful of the fact that we have to balance everyone's interests together.
So are you finding, and maybe this is not a question for you guys, but are you finding that this Buy American philosophy is actually in practicality being practiced and is practical?
It's being practiced at least as far as the government agencies are concerned, because they are ramping up, as we mentioned, the investigations, cracking down on what President Trump perceives to be an abuse of the H-1B visa. But practical, I would say no. I don't think it's practical.
Well, buying American, I'm as I'm hearing you, sounds a little bit different from the hire American.
Right.
So when we talk about the visas, that is more towards the hire Americans.
That's right.
And so, okay, well, I guess I'm understanding.
Well,
what you're saying.
from an administrative point of view, what we found, and even going back, I guess, to September, I attended a meeting at the Vermont Service Center. It's an open stakeholders meeting where anyone who has an interest in immigration-related issues can attend. And they had a guy there who was piped in from Washington, D.C., and I believe he was at the program that you were at yesterday, who is the Buy American, they call him BAHA, Buy American, Hire American. I love the way they call it BAHA, you know, because it's supposed to sound warm and
that's
fuzzy.
innocuous, yeah, right?
Exactly. BAHA, yeah, okay,
Like,
I'll go get a drink. Right. So they call it Buy American, Hire American, and there's a guy who works for the Department of Homeland Security who I guess is integrating the BAHA concepts into all of these memos, and slowly they're coming out with these memos that deal with all of the different immigration procedures and all the classifications. So they're slowly integrating this philosophy into what's going on, you know, at the administrative level. So it's very interesting.
But it's not going through a formal rulemaking process,
Correct. Right.
which is scary because it's not transparent.
Right.
So
Just memos.
So give us an example, and not necessarily of the memos, but give us an example of an administrative change that it was problematic and didn't go through the proper or what we would consider the proper process.
Well, I think the biggest one is the 221G administrative processing cases. So what we've noticed since the previous Trump executive orders.
So what are
by American
221Gs?
So 221G is when you go to the U.S. consulate abroad for your visa and they're not able to approve your case. So they put you in administrative processing, which is 221G. However, they don't disclose to you the reason for the administrative processing. But we're finding many of our clients that go back home that are just stuck in administrative processing for months. I have some clients that have been stuck for over a year now, and they're not told why. You know, whether it's a security threat, previous visa violations, they just don't know.
So we get calls from individuals who are stuck in this 221G administrative hold at the U.S. consulates abroad for, as Nahal was saying, for extended periods of time, and they don't know why. And we sort of know, at least academically, why it could be. So what we have to, for example, if an individual has studied something that might be on what's called the technical alert list.
Well, what would be on the technical alert?
So
flight school,
right, exactly,
right.
Or I had a geologist. I had a geologist who was doing something in seismology, and they felt that he might be. I guess the question was, could he create an earthquake? And they had him in an administrative hold for a long time. We were finally able to clear the administrative hold. But I'm like, you know, this is a rocks for jocks guy. Why are we having, you know, this professor of geology stuck in administrative hold, you know, at the U.S. consulate abroad? But it happens.
Right. And what's interesting is that these people had previously been approved for visas. It's not as if they're applying for the first time. So we have clients that have previous B1, B2 visas, F1 visas, H1Bs. Now all of a sudden, I had one guy from, I think, Egypt that called me the other day and said he was ready to board a flight in London, and they checked his papers and they said, no, I'm sorry, we have to revoke your visa. And he pulled him off the flight.
Able to travel.
Now he's trying to figure out why, and then he said, you know, I made 13 trips over the last several years visiting different schools. So
I'm just going to say one thing, because I think about this also as you do, and like, does this sound like backdoor travel ban to you? It's like
it's interesting. Most of the clients are from these.
Those exactly.
Right.
So it's in a way it's a backdoor travel ban, slowing the process down for people who are from the countries where maybe there's an issue. Okay, maybe there's an issue. I mean, it's clear what they're doing with the travel ban, because they're saying those countries are definitely not on the same wavelength as we are security-wise. They're not trading information with us. I think Chad finally came on online. They said, okay, Chad is off the travel ban because they're cooperating with us.
So all the damage that's being done, is that ultimately going to be reversible?
That's a great question. Wow. I am cautiously optimistic.
We'll see in
that-
2020, I
yeah,
guess.
Exactly. I think that comes down to, are you talking about 4 years or are you talking about 8 years? Because obviously there's a lot of damage that can continue to be done over the course of 8 years. I think 4 years, maybe it's reversible. 8 years,
Oh,
it might
midterm
be.
elections.
Right, and midterm elections obviously are
Right.
affecting, that's a big thing
These are
right
big
now.
issues,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right.
So I hesitate to call this BAHA because that does sound too sweet. But what are it's sweet and deceiving. So give us your final words on this Buy American, Hire American order and philosophy and its impact. What is it that you want the viewer to know and think about, take away from this?
It sounds great. Buy American, hire American. I think that most people would agree we should do that. Rely less on foreign-made products. That certainly will strengthen and grow the economy. However, I think that what's happening in reality with curtailing some of these immigration policies is having huge impacts on these workers that are desperately needed in this country to do the jobs that U.S. companies cannot find skilled workers to do.
I think it comes down to a question of whether or not you believe that the growth we're seeing in our country is because of us being insular, or whether it's because of international investment and international growth. So you have to sort of go to one philosophy or the other. And you have to say, well, what's better for our country? Is our nation better off having lots of international infusion of capital and thought process and the entrepreneurial spirit that comes from foreign nations? Or is it better to be insular and to see what is going to happen that way? I don't know. I mean, I think that it really comes down to deciding which philosophy is the best one.
Well, David, Nahal, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you. Until next time, this was Know Your Rights in Jersey.